Give it a try.
That got your attention, didn't it? I think we can turn it down just a little bit. Okay, still a little bit loud. Okay, I think this, how's that? Everybody? Loud? Maybe a little bit lower. Okay, how's that? We got lots of thumbs up, so I guess that's it. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, even though it's not the scriptural 5 minutes after start time. We'll go ahead and get started because we've got lots of ground to cover today, as we do every week when we're in Revelation. And we are down to the second of the 7 churches in Asia to whom Jesus spoke in that 1st century AD. And now keep in mind several things, particularly for the benefit of the folks who haven't been here. Jesus communicated with these 7 churches, and we said we know there were more than 7 churches at this time, more than 7 that Paul established. And we talked about, again for review, why did he only pick 7? What's the significance of 7 churches? Complete. Very good. Complete. Now that's my brother-in-law. He wasn't even here and he knew that answer. So I certainly expect everybody that was here to chime in this morning. 7 was the numerology that was so popular in the 1st century, and particularly in apocalyptic literature, was very, very important. And as I'll remind you, it's pretty obvious that this message that Jesus is bringing through the Apostle John to these 7 churches was intended not just for those individual churches, but for all the churches. Because as you remember, we talked about these 7 churches were on what we call this Roman postal road that went up the east shore of the Aegean Sea and then turned to the west and then or to the east and then went straight down. 3 of the churches were on the left leg, if you will, and 4 of the churches on the right leg. And we're going to deal with the 2nd church today and possibly get into the 3rd church this morning, depending on time. But this first church is called Smyrna. Now, it's fascinating because as we've talked about before, every single one of these individual congregations were different. And as we talked about, every single one of these congregations were very definitely influenced by the environment in which they were located. By the way, I've got drops in my mouth because my voice is pretty weak this morning, and it's potent. And so if any of you on these first few rows, your eyes start watering, you'll know what it was. But the bottom line is, this church is kind of dissimilar to us. Not just because of 2,000 years, and not just because of the ethnicity of the people that were there, but this, of all the 7 churches, they were experiencing more persecution than any of the other churches. I mean, dramatic persecution. And if you'll remember, why was Jesus, what was the thesis, the focal point of his message to all 7 churches? Why did he communicate with them? He made it plain in that first chapter, and then to each individual church. What was he trying to accomplish with these 7 churches?
I think they all had a problem, and he was correcting this problem. He's wanting them to recognize what they do and correct themselves. Even the one that didn't have much of a problem still had one.
Yeah, that's a very good point. 5 of the 7 churches had some things. I have this against you, he said. 2 of the 7, he didn't say anything against them. Smyrna, one that we're going to talk about today, in Philadelphia. And so he didn't say anything about corrective action with them. But the bottom line is, you think back, as we talked about, this is about 60 years after Jesus has left the earth. And during that 60 years, persecution has ramped up. There's only one of the 7 churches where there's no indication any persecution is taking place. And do you think that these folks might be starting to get a little bit discouraged? As we're going to talk about today, the folks at Smyrna, they were being hammered. They were being hammered. And the theme, as we talked about in our introductory remarks 2 weeks ago, the whole theme of Revelation is positive. It's victory. You're going to win. Hang in there. And you can see why. I mean, anybody here, any of us ever get discouraged now? And I don't know about you, but when we came to worship this morning, I didn't worry about the police standing out here and throwing me in jail. I didn't worry about somebody beating me walking through the parking lot because I was a Christian. I didn't worry about that. We thank God for the fact that we can worship in a peaceful manner, but that's not the case a lot of places in the world. We had a missionary that we supported at Highway 36 in Abilene from India. And he would tell stories about persecution, the Buddhists persecuting the Christians, that would boggle your mind. And without going into detail, he had the scars to prove it. The literal physical scars to prove it. It's hard for me. I've been so blessed in my life. I've never experienced anything like that. Little verbal haranguing occasionally, little criticism, little sarcasm. That'd be about it. I mean, but there are people, and these folks in Smyrna were some of them, that literally were putting their life on the line every single day, as we shall see. Now, let's talk a little bit about the city of Smyrna. As we said, Smyrna is on that Roman postal road. It is a seacoast town right there on the Aegean Sea. The Aegean was a mariner's paradise. It was right up here at the top of the Mediterranean Sea. And if you look at a map, the Aegean Sea is full of islands. And very seldom were storms an issue in the Aegean Sea. In fact, Smyrna had the nickname the Port of Asia. It was so popular and such a great natural seaport that commerce from all over the Roman world, which was surrounding that Mediterranean Sea, flowed in and out of Smyrna. Very powerful, very, very wealthy city. And all depending on trade, basically. And because of that, as we talked about last week, kind of the same thing with Ephesus down south. This is about 25 miles north of Ephesus. It was kind of a great hodgepodge of ethnicities. There are people from literally all over the then known world in the city of Smyrna. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about that Ephesus was a religious city. Y'all remember that? I think I went off, didn't I? Looks like I'm going to get to hold a microphone after all. Ephesus was a religious center. And do you remember the goddess that was literally revered around the ancient world that was located in the temple in Ephesus? Artemis, goddess of fertility. And Artemis, we went back in Acts the 19th chapter and looked at the furor that had developed with Paul back about, 50 years before, something like that. And so they were already used to some pretty good opposition because of this religious controversy. Well, Smyrna really didn't have the religious emphasis. Now, they had a focus on what we might call religion today, but their focus was more political. And that Smyrna, according to ancient historians, as well as we get this clue here in Revelation as well, Smyrna was a hotbed of what we call the emperor cult. Does anybody have an idea of what the emperor cult was? We're kind of giving a little bit of insight on this from the first week, and we mentioned it last week too. You remember, trivia time, who do we strongly believe, is the Roman emperor? Starts with a D. Domitian. Very good. Domitian is the Roman emperor. And remember, I talked about the fact this arrogant guy, he has his coin printed up with his son holding 7 stars in his right hand. What was the symbolism? What was Domitian saying to all the folks in the Roman Empire? Exactly. The universe, the world, my family, we're in charge of everything. Jesus said in the first chapter, and we're going to see here in the second chapter too, he's going to say, nope, it's not Domitian, not his bloodline that's holding the destiny of the universe. It's who? Jesus said, it's me. But this gives us a little insight to the emperor cult, because Domitian, and he wasn't the only one of the Roman emperors that wanted to tell people and convince people that they were deity. They were gods with a little g. And Domitian was especially infamous for this. And there was what was called the emperor cult, which was basically emperor worship. You may be familiar with World War II Japan. You know, Emperor Hirohito, he was revered throughout Japan as a god. And anything he said was divine. And Domitian propagated that same lie to the Roman Empire. Now, say, well, how did that affect the Christians? Well, you've got to understand that where this emperor cult was ingrained, that these cities, particularly Smyrna, they had what were called trade guilds. What was a trade guild? Just very good. The predecessor to unions. And you had to buy, if you were going to engage in the economy, particularly if you're going to sell anything, but even if you wanted to buy anything, you had to be a member of these trade guilds. If I was a carpenter in Smyrna, I had to be a member of that trade guild or I couldn't work. Again, it's very similar to what the trade unions do. You've got to be a member of the guild. But there was one stipulation, particularly in these Roman cities with these emperor cults. You had to not only swear allegiance to the emperor, but you had to swear total allegiance. And Christians couldn't do that. Why? Because
their allegiance was to God, and they weren't going to put anybody above him.
Very good. Their allegiance was to God, was to Christ. It wasn't to Domitian or any other human being. Hence, the folks in Smyrna were totally cut out of the economy. And historians of antiquity will say there was literal starvation among the Christian, particularly the Jewish Christian population in a lot of cities, including Smyrna, because they couldn't buy anything, they couldn't sell anything. They were economically destitute. And Jesus will mention this in his message to them in just a minute. And you've got to understand that, like we've talked about all along, you've got to have a real good understanding of the history at that time and the symbolism at that time to really understand what Jesus' message was. Now, that was going to mean something when he talks about their poverty in just a minute to them, and he's not going to say that to like Laodicea. They apparently had no persecution. They were wealthy in a physical sense, but the folks in Smyrna were hurting. So let's go ahead and get started here with the text itself. Like I say, we may actually get into a little bit of introduction here in a few minutes of Pergamum. But Jesus starts out the same way he does to all the churches. To the angel of the church of Smyrna write. By the way, this is current Izmir, Turkey. Smyrna is now Izmir, Turkey. So it's right there on that seacoast. That is a powerful. He says, the first and the last who was dead and who has come to life. And we all understand that. Again, I'll remind you, these little brief introductions that he gives to all 7 churches, he's already said that in the first chapter. So he's just repeating these things. Why do you think it was so important to these Christians at the end of the first century for Jesus to remind them he's still alive? Perfect. I think that one key word, hope, if you couldn't hear, to give them hope. Like I say, it's been right at 6 decades since Jesus has left the earth. These people, many of them were expecting him to come back the next 30 minutes, and he hadn't done it yet. And the persecutions become more intense. And so Jesus is assuring them, I'm alive. Do you think our society today needs that message? Oh, man, our society needs that today. I love that song that we sometimes sing, Our God, He is Alive. I think we probably ought to sing it a whole lot more often to make sure we remember, as the message he gives to Domitian, that the Lord is in control. And sometimes we forget that, and I'm sure these people were as well. So verse 9, he says, just like he does to all of the churches, he says, I know what's going on. In this particular case, I know your tribulation. As I say, you'll see as we go through here, none of the other churches are suffering the way these people are. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you're rich. Now, we just talked about the emperor cult, and we talked about the trade guilds, so that makes sense. These folks are, again, many of them destitute, and historians say some of them are literally starving to death. Jesus said, I know that. Why was that important? I know what you're going through. Why is that important? Exactly. And I think we could kind of make a personal, you got my attention, a personal revelation here when you think, have you ever had some malady, maybe a physical ailment or a difficult situation or whatever, and someone comes to you and say, I went through that same thing and I made it. What does that do for you? Gives you confidence. Good way to put it. Gives you confidence. Jesus is giving them confidence here. But then he adds, and they knew they were poor, and they knew they were suffering, and they knew they were destitute. Pardon me. But Jesus says, but you're rich. What do you mean by that? They had eternal life. They had something greater than anything on this earth. You remember the old Lou Gehrig speech in Yankee Stadium? He has ALS, horrible debilitating disease, doesn't have much longer to live, and he stands before the Yankee Stadium crowd, packed to capacity, adoration for Lou Gehrig. And do you remember what Lou said? I'm the luckiest man in the world. I imagine there were a whole lot of those people. What? Here's just once great. I'm okay. My cough drop's working overtime, I promise. Here he is, this once great baseball idol, really. And now he's shriveled up. His muscular tone is gone. He had to be helped to get up there to the microphone. But why do you think Lou Gehrig said that? I'm the luckiest man in the world. Well, I do too. And he looks around and he sees this adoring mass of people. He says, I'm blessed. I'm blessed. And you know, when we look around and when those folks looked around, as Carlin said, what they had superseded any of the troubles pardon me, that they were looking at. You know, I don't know why my voice is so shot after a weekend with my sister, my brother-in-law. Dan did all the talking. I just listened. Yeah. So anyway, and then he goes on and he says something that we should understand from what we looked at in Ephesus last week. And the blasphemy of those who are Jews, who say they are Jews, but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Now, I'll take you back in your minds, what we talked about last week. You go back to Acts the 19th chapter, you know, when Paul was there, and Paul was performing miracles, healing people, and people were flocking to Paul, and they were even using their handkerchiefs. If we can just touch him with our handkerchief, we can be healed. Just a magnificent scene. And then there were some Jewish false prophets, if you will, who were running around saying what? Do you remember? Yeah, he's of Satan, and we're really part of this Jesus, this Jesus Christo, they would say. We belong to him too. They were, in effect, prevaricating. They were lying. And he makes reference to that right here. There were people, because of all the impact. You remember what the naysayers said of Paul? It doesn't matter where this guy goes in the world. He's turned the world upside down. They wanted to be a part of that reputation. But he says, there are these people that they say, when he says they say they are Jews, they're not necessarily physically claiming to be Jews. When he uses that word Jews right here, what's he talking about? What's the significance, the symbolism? Throughout history, who had been God's people? The Jews had been. And so he said, what he's saying is, they're claiming to be of God, and they're not. He says they're a part of the synagogue of Satan, which he tells us, as you just mentioned, they belong to Satan. They don't belong to God. Wake up and understand that concept. Now he goes on. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. You think that might have been just a little bit shocking to these Christians? Because as we shall see in a minute, and as was verified by secular historians, we have these stories, you know, these images of people being rounded up, taken to the Colosseums and the public meeting places, and being put to death publicly. And he says, don't fear it. Don't fear it. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, I can't remember, is there any other reference in the Bible to Smyrna, the church at Smyrna?
You know, not that I know of.
I don't remember any.
No.
And that is really kind of significant because they were isolated in this city.
Yeah.
And I think that's the importance of God's word to them.
Yeah.
Was the fact that they were so isolated in the area of sin there. And I couldn't remember, though. Sorry.
No, that's all right. If anybody else I don't remember Smyrna being specifically singled out anywhere else in the New Testament. And I really believe that's one of the reasons that Jesus chose 7 churches that were in such literal close proximity. Now, 25 miles in those days would have been a pretty good jaunt, particularly on foot. But as we mentioned the first week, it was apparent that all 7 churches, even though these were addressed to individuals, these letters would be shared. That's very common. You know, the Pauline epistles, all those epistles he wrote, those were shared among the churches. And probably each one of these messages were shared with each one of the churches. And I think part of that was, as you say, they felt isolated. But now they know what the other brethren in close proximity are dealing with as well. So that's a very, very good point. But he says this to them, I know what you're going through, and I know he specifically mentions the economic persecution, and then he goes just a little bit farther here. He says, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison. Again, Roman history, we know that was a very common trait. These folks were just thrown into prison. We just talked about when John's revealing this message. Where's John? He's on the Isle of Patmos, which was basically a place where they just threw people they didn't want to mess with anymore. And so he's on the Isle of Patmos. And then he makes a very interesting statement here. And you'll be tested. You know, have you ever thought about any time that we have difficulty in our life? God has a purpose for that test. And Satan has a purpose for that test. What is Satan's purpose when you have trouble, when I have trouble, when we have difficulties, when we have trials, when we have temptations? What is Satan's objective in that?
Separate us from God.
Perfect. Separate us from God. What is God's purpose for that? Bring us closer to God. I mean, that's pretty simplistic, but that is right, spot on. Anytime I have a difficulty or trouble, somewhere God is saying, if you will stand firm, and we're going to talk about that more in just a minute, and that's a message to all these 7 churches. You just stand firm, you're going to be okay, and you're going to draw closer to me. Satan has a desire to tear us apart. God has a desire to embrace us further. And that's what he's saying in this church at Smyrna right here. Can you imagine, here these Christians, they're suffering so badly in Smyrna. Do you think any of them might be saying, why? God, we're the good guys. We're the ones that are faithful. We are the ones that are making all these sacrifices, and we're hurting. Why? Well, Paul says here, and he's going to talk about it more in just a minute. He says, because if you do, remain firm, you're going to win. Is that the promise he makes to us? Yeah, in fact, a very, very powerful statement he makes in just a second we're going to talk about from the church of Smyrna. Now, he goes on and he makes a fascinating statement here. And you will have tribulation for 10 days. Well, that didn't sound too bad, does it? I can handle anything for 10 days. How do you explain that? Nobody? I'm sorry? Okay, that's one possible explanation. If you go back and you look at the apocalyptic literature, and it's just like we talked about, you know, there are certain things that had certain messages that everybody understood, and it wasn't just in Revelation or Daniel or Ezekiel or some other quote-unquote religious writing, but in secular apocalyptic literature too. And these dates and these times and these numbers all held significance. Let me give you an example. If Carlin called me, he said, Monday morning, I'm going to buy you the biggest ribeye steak in Fort Worth. Are you listening, Carlin? This is hypothetical. Because if he bought me the biggest ribeye steak, sooner or later, I'd be obliged to do the same thing. And after the money I spent moving to Fort Worth, I don't have it. But Carlin says, I'm going to buy you a steak. Okay, I'm going to meet you. I'm going to meet you in the stockyards at your choice of steakhouse at 12 o'clock. Okay. Well, Carlin's down there. It's 12 o'clock, and I'm not there yet. So he calls me on the phone. I'm hurrying, trying to get through traffic. This old country boy's not used to city traffic yet. I'm trying to get there. Carlin says, where are you? And I say, I'll be there in a New York minute. What? How do you interpret a New York minute? Is a minute in New York City less than 60 seconds? What does that mean? What would that mean? It's kind of like the cats and dogs raining that we talked about before. What does that mean? I'll be there as fast as I can. I'll be there very, very quickly. That 10 days is a short, unspecified amount of time in apocalyptic literature. He's saying this is not going to last that long. But it's not a literal 10 days. The problem is if you start taking that literally, there's a whole lot of things you got to take literally, and it will completely skew the message of Revelation. And so he's just saying to them, hey, this is not going to last forever. It's not going to last that long. You just continue to hang in there. In fact, if you'll look there, he goes on and he says, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of righteousness. You just hang in there and you be faithful. And then the message he gives us here, in fact, the Greek scholars say where it says be faithful in the NASB unto death, they say a better translation is you be faithful even if you have to die. Even if you have to die. And then he says, even if you have to die, I will give you the crown of life. Now, Smyrna was well known for their love of athletic events. Now, they're just across the Aegean Sea, almost directly across from Athens. And we know how the Athenians loved athletic events, kind of like the Americans do. People were just engrossed in athletic events. And the common custom was they didn't give trophies, they didn't give medals. The victor, whether it was a race or a javelin throwing event or wrestling or whatever it was, they received a laurel wreath that was woven and put around their head. Y'all seen pictures of the Roman Caesars? They all had these wreaths, laurel wreaths around their head. The Greek word for it was Stephanos. They had these Stephanos, every one of them, which they were saying, we're the winners. And what he's saying is, I'll give you a symbol of victory. You're going to be a winner, depending upon whether or not you do what. You stay faithful. Just stay faithful, and you're guaranteed a win. Think about that. Think about that for a minute. I mean, these people, I don't think any of us can really empathize with what they're going through, but all of us have been through tough times. And if you'll allow me just a moment, indulge me for a moment. 10 years ago, I was laying in the hospital in the ICU having a stroke. I just had an ICU doctor tell me that I was on the brink of another major stroke and that I could very easily die. That may have been the greatest thing that ever happened to me, because I'm laying there, and first the words are earth-shattering. I've been arguing with him for 3 days. I shouldn't be here. I didn't have a stroke. I'm too young, too healthy. I work out too much. I shouldn't be here. Can you imagine telling the doctor, you don't know what you're talking about? But that was the way I was. But it was a Saturday night in ICU. I was all by myself. Dean had to leave. And I'm laying there, and honestly, I felt a calm go over me that I had never experienced. And that calm was, even if he's right and this is it, I'm okay. I'm okay. And every time, in fact, I don't know how many times that verse ran through my mind that Saturday night. It was just something, it was so peaceful. And I don't think if I had ever not experienced what I had, that to this point that I would really understand that. But that's what he was saying to these people. And then in verse 11, he says the same thing that he says to all 7 churches. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. That's pretty clear. What did Jesus just say? I'm sorry? Everybody listen. You remember there what we call the Mount of Transfiguration? When Jesus and Peter and James and John are standing there, and they have seen Moses and Elijah. Now, I don't know how they knew that was Moses and Elijah. Do you? I want to ask when I get to heaven, how did you guys know that was Moses and Elijah? There weren't any pictures. There wasn't any TV. How did they know that? Well, they knew it. I guess it was name tags. Written in Greek, I'm sure. But Peter, impetuous Peter. Peter pops up and says, I know what we ought to do. We ought to build 3 tabernacles or 3 altars to honor Jesus and Moses and Elijah. And then that booming voice came and said, this is my beloved son. Listen to him. Listen to him. And we know the flaw in Peter's logic. I mean, it's admirable that he had this desire to do something to honor Jesus, but he was going to honor Jesus on the same plane as Moses and Elijah. That wasn't right. But God said, and I think probably God sometimes won't tell me the same thing. Peter, hush. Greg, hush. And listen to God's word. How many of you are familiar with Dr. Carl Spain? Dr. Spain was a professor, Bible professor at ACU way a long time ago. And I had the privilege, I was kind of an interim preacher down at Winters when I was in college. It's a long story. I won't bore you with it today, but ended up down there just filling in until they found a full-time preacher. And they had a gospel meeting, and Dr. Spain was the speaker. One of the most brilliant men I've ever been around. And one whole Sunday afternoon between the morning service and the evening service of that gospel meeting, the first day, Dr. Spain and I sat down. He talked all afternoon, and I listened. And maybe the best advice, in those days I had no desire to, or aspirations to be a preacher. But he told me, he said, now, I really believe you're going to make a preacher. And he said, I'll tell you what. He said, if you'll go through spells when you think, what can I preach on? What can I preach on? He says, and if you don't know, just open up the Bible and spend 15, 20 minutes reading to the congregation. And listen. I still remember him emphasizing that word. Listen to what God says, because you're not going to improve on that. And that's what I see he's saying here. Listen to what I'm saying. He's been talking about the fact, hey, you folks are not victims. You folks are victors. Listen to that. Listen to that. And then he goes on, and this is self-explanatory. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. Now, I told you last week, right when we finished, if you look over there in verse 7 of chapter 2, when he's talking to the folks at Ephesus, he says, he who has to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to churches. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. And I told you, you're going to see that word overcomes all the way through Revelation. And when he's talking about overcomes, it has a special meaning and special significance. He also uses interchangeably the word, he who conquers is going to win. And every time, if you go back and you look at the derivation of that word, the Greek word there, it means to be willing to be a martyr. Being willing to lay down your life. Now again, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to a lot of people. And I'm sure that some of these folks in Smyrna were struggling with that. He who overcomes, he who dies for your faith are going to win. How can I win if I die? That's Satan's greatest trump card right there. That's what he tried to do with Jesus. Did physical death defeat Jesus? Everybody shake your head this way. Yeah. It's kind of like Adrian said last week, I just want to make sure y'all are awake. No. That physical death and resurrection brought about victory. And he says to the folks in Smyrna, same thing's going to happen to you. Sure, they may throw you in prison. Sure, some of you may starve to death. Some of you may be fed to the wild beast. Some of you may be burned at the stake. Sure, that may happen. But you know what, he says? You're willing to be a martyr. You overcome. You conquer. You're going to win. You're good. Now, I was an athlete my whole life. And I never entered into a ball game of any kind, football, basketball, baseball, anything, that I knew 100% I was going to win. I mean, Carter, did you ever tell one of your kids, okay, guys, don't worry, you can't lose? Of course you didn't. But that's what Jesus just said to them, and that's what Jesus just said to us. You can't lose. Is that encouraging? You know, I try to remember when I really get down. I try to remember that. Doesn't matter what happens, I still win. And that's a promise, again, to every one of us. Any comments? Yes, sir.
I guess something I had to learn, like you're saying, with Carlin in the football team, you know, football any given Sunday, but sometimes there is a team you already know you can beat, but it seems like, you know, what God is telling us, if you stay with the protocol, stay with the game plan, stay with the things that you've been taught and you've been with, then you'll be able to overcome. But sometimes we can put our guard down like teams and think we had a victory and get overtaken or overcome in an instant because we underestimate the enemy, you know. So I think that's, you know, always encouraging to us too, to kind of keep with God's armor and continue to fight the way he taught us to fight. So
excellent point. You know, we understand, you know, you go to Ephesians 6, you look at what Paul tells the church at Ephesus, here's what you're up against. You're up against an awesome power. And we don't want to underestimate that at all. But the message throughout is God's a whole lot more powerful. Yes, sir.
I think one of the most significant things in our lives is that we have the difficulty keeping our mind out of this world and on God. That is our greatest difficulty, to do that. If we can do that, then we have all the peace in the world here.
I agree with you 100%. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think we give in to Satan if we do that. Well, it's almost time for us to end this morning. Carlin, you weren't here last week, and I told him I was going to do this in private, but I said I'm going to beg Carlin to give me a few more Sundays after August to finish up, because we just finished up the second of the 7 churches, and there's only 2 weeks of August left, and there's no way we can cover 5 churches in 2 days.
Educational year lasts through May.
Oh, okay, well, I know you were struggling in your mind, what am I going to get Greg for Christmas? And that'll be my Christmas present right there. It'd be a ribeye steak, right? So, anyway, thank y'all all very, very much for being here today. If you haven't met my sister and my brother-in-law, be sure to do so. We've had a tremendous weekend. Well, you know, what she's laughing about, one of the first times they visited when I was preaching at Highway 36, I thought it was going to be funny. And I thought it was. I thought it was hysterical. And Jerry laughed too. I introduced them as, this is my brother-in-law, Jerry, and his wife. And I caught all kinds of grief over that. So the next time they came, I said, this is my mom and dad's daughter. And can you imagine being that narrow-minded, being upset about something? But anyway, I just decided that today I was going to say, this is my sister and her husband, Jerry, my brother-in-law, of whom I'm both very, very proud for both of them. Thank you, sir. And we're so glad they're here and hope they can come back more often. Thank you. And thank you all so much, because several of you mentioned for praying for Terry and her recent surgery, and everything's gone fantastic. And we're thrilled. Thank you very much.